Welcome everyone. I'm Shaban. I'm from the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. So we work with Spanish and Italian colleagues on a project called MILIEU, and you received invitation, I believe, through this webpage. And today we have Lucia Vázquez Rodríguez, and Lucia is going to speak about useful resources in gender studies. And I can invite you now. You can say a few words and then you can continue.
Thank you, Shaban, for the introduction and for inviting me here to this wonderful project that you are working on with some of my colleagues from Complutense. So my name is Lucia Vázquez, as Shaban has said, and because I'm going to be talking throughout the entire conference about the importance of situated knowledge and the personal is political and the importance of identity when we're dealing with issues that have to do with gender and sexual orientation and desire and so on. I'm going to just say a few words about myself to give you some context. So when I started studying, I really wanted to work in the film industry because that was my passion at the time. I moved to Hollywood and I had a horrendous experience, #MeToo, which already reinforced my feminist beliefs and my activism, my position as an activist. In fact, I now consider my scholarly practice as an extension of my activism and my values and my impulse to fight for gender and sexual orientation and LGBTIQ+ rights. I think this is also a very important aspect because, as Savan and I were discussing before, we're now witnessing a time in which some parts of the feminist movement have been warring against LGBTIQ+ rights, particularly with regards to the issue of trans rights and trans activism. So I position myself first and foremost by saying that I am a woman, but I'm also queer, and these are my two main areas of interest as a scholar and as a lecturer. So I did my master's in film and philosophy at King's College in London, and that's where I started getting interested with more queer studies. Before, most of my research had to do with issues of the male gaze and stereotypical representation of women in the media, but then I discovered queer theory there, and that provided me with different theoretical tools and methodological tools to address some of the concerns and the subject matters that I was interested in. Then I moved to Complutense in Madrid to pursue a PhD in audiovisual communication. I wrote a thesis that combined these two interests that intersect inevitably. And my thesis was on queer cinema directed by Latin American women. So as you can see, intersectionality is going to be an overarching theme throughout this entire presentation. And I am a member of a research group that's called GECA. This is basically, if not the first, one of the pioneers research groups in gender and audiovisual communication in Spain. And now I am a lecturer at UCL in London. Well, now since very recently, like a month ago. So if we have early career scholars with us, this is just to let you know that there is some hope. There are jobs for us out there. It's not as precarious and terrible as a lot of people will have us believe. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen now. I titled the presentation Useful Resources for Researchers in Gender Studies. I could have given it a number of other titles, but I wanted to make it as practical and informative as possible. I'm going to be drawing on a lot of examples and experiences I've had in my career as a researcher in gender studies. As you can imagine from my brief introduction, I specialize in issues that have to do with media and communication. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that. I apologize because I am aware that there are people that may be coming from other disciplines, but like I said before, situated knowledge is quite important as a gender studies scholar. So this is a little table of content that I have here. And I put that statement up there because I think it's important to acknowledge that while gender studies might be a sort of like established and well-known discipline in various contexts, including the UK, where I'm at now, in other countries, this is not like such a developed field of study. So sometimes we have to not only face the typical difficulties that all researchers and academics face in our careers, like the difficulty in accessing funding, the precariousness of the job market, but also we need to deal with people asking us what on earth we're doing, like, is this something that we can study? And accusing us of being overly political or too personal or too emotional. So, I mean, we all know about this. And so I have organized my presentation in 4 different areas. One has to do with like research tips. So I'm going to be talking about some databases that can be using, useful resources for teaching and learning. Essentially, the point that I'm going to be making throughout this first part of the presentation is that there are a bazillion resources available for us as researchers in gender studies. And it is a pity that we're not aware of them, because sometimes we're just like replicating the findings of other scholars, or coming up with entire sort of like workshops on gender, or like modules for university degrees where there are pre-existing things that might help us. I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the journals that are useful to be familiar with on gender studies, and a little bit about the publishing strategy that might be most efficient when we're trying to build a career for ourselves. Then I'm also going to be talking about funding opportunities, and this is actually one of the parts which might leave you with a more optimistic kind of like overview of the field, because right now I'm happy to say that gender studies, gender equality, sexuality studies is quite high in the agenda of international institutions such as the United Nations or the EU. So there are a lot of opportunities for us out there if we are willing to work a bit. And then some conferences I'm going to be mentioning that will be happening like very soon, in case you're looking for places where you can disseminate your research. I will, however, start with some key concepts, and I apologize in advance because I am aware that some of you might already be familiar with these ideas and these debates in the field of gender studies, but I thought it was important to sort of like touch base, and in case some of us aren't, or just to sort of inform the debates that I hope we will be having by the end of my presentation. So I think that because, as I was saying before, gender studies, nobody really knows what it means as a field, but it definitely touches upon matters of gender identity, sexual orientation, gender roles, and therefore it inevitably intersects with LGBTIQ+ studies, queer theory, and so on. So I left there like a little cute illustration with like some terms that I think might be useful, because not everyone that comes from a feminist background understands, for example, what being non-binary means or what being queer means. So I just left it there in case it's of interest for anyone. I'm very happy to share the presentation with Shaban by the end of it. I believe it's quite important, however, like to make the distinction between sex and gender, because well, this is something that informs our research, no matter what our field is. And I understand that even the definitions of sex and gender change depending on our disciplines and our context. But essentially, sex would be the set of biological characteristics, especially genetic and hormonal, on the basis of which the distinction between men and women is established. And this, well, sex does not necessarily determine our behavior or our gender identity. And I would go as far as to say that not even sex is as binary as the patriarchal system will lead us to believe, because we do have intersexual people, for example. And then gender identity would be the subjective perception that a person has about themselves in terms of feeling male, feeling female, or feeling both, or feeling neither. Gender identity depends very, very much on our cultural background. So even though in the Western world, traditionally, we had only two available gender identities, which are man or women, in other societies, for example, in Thailand, they've had a third gender forever. This is not a modern thing. This is not something that is in fashion now. And this third gender has been called the katoi. In India, we have a third gender that is called the hijras, and these are people that do not identify as men or women, but do have a certain social standing in their communities. They're not necessarily marginalized. Again, this is to say that the idea of a third gender, of like, or a fourth or a fifth, is not new, in spite of what some extreme right politicians might make us want to believe. So I have a little QR there that I would like to ask you to scan, because it gives us access to WOOC Lab, talking about resources for teaching in gender studies. I I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about technology as well. So I'm just gonna be sharing. Oh, sorry, I need to share it longer to allow you to. Sorry, to allow you to scan it. Yeah. So if you could please do that. This leads us to WOOC Lab, which is a resource that I utilize very often in my classes, because particularly with COVID and working remotely and having to teach online, it's very difficult to keep the attention of the students, as you probably know. So yeah, please let me know once you have had the chance to scan it.
I think that's quite enough.
Okay, I wasn't sure.
No.
Okay, so I'm gonna now share the actual WOOC Lab, which I have here, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so I just put here a couple of questions to sort of like, because I talked a lot about myself, but I don't really know who's in the room with us. So just to allow you to answer and say something. I think this is an important question. What has led you to become a researcher in gender studies? I think there are fields of research that have nothing to do with our identity, our values, our sort of priorities in life, and don't touch us emotionally to the same degree that gender studies or sexuality studies or affect studies, race studies, all of these issues that have to do with identity do. So I am curious, and this is why I'm asking this question. In my case, it was a mix of dissatisfaction with the representation of women that I was seeing on the media that I consumed, and my own experience trying to make it in production, in film production, when I was living in LA. So it was, yeah, personal, 100% personal. Sisterhood, importance, experience. As you can see, this tool is like quite cute. Like it allows you to use a number of applications to ask questions, and like it's like live to people. Yeah, people that inspire you is quite important. Being queer, I suppose. Fight against hate, how important. I think this is more or less enough. But yeah, in case you didn't know, this tool is called WOOC Lab, and I 100% recommend it because, as I was saying before, if connection with our community is important, no matter what we're doing as researchers and teachers, when we're talking about these issues, allowing the people that you're sort of like giving your conference to talk a little bit about themselves and express their interests and concerns matters. So I have another question here for you, and that's it. That's only 2 questions. And the question is, what are the main difficulties that you have faced in your career as a gender scholar? I'm going to minimize this. Personally, I would say number one and number two were my main obstacles. But I am kind of hoping that after this presentation, you will have a better idea of actually how many opportunities, funding opportunities, particularly for postdoc students, for pre-doc might be a little bit trickier, are available for us as gender scholars. So it seems that lack of funding is a main concern. And gender studies not being considered a serious field of knowledge in our context. Yeah, there is a lot of institutional resistance in some contexts to sort of like taking this field seriously, which honestly doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But anyway, I'm gonna stop sharing now and go back to the presentation. So even though I said that gender studies as a field is difficult to define, I sort of provided a working, like operative definition there. It is the field for interdisciplinary study that is devoted to gender identity and gender representation as central categories for analysis. I think that there is a term here that is key, which is the term interdisciplinary. There are contexts in which gender studies is considered like a field of research of its own right, but there are many other contexts in which it's more like a surname. So you would be doing economics with a gender perspective, or you would be doing media studies with a feminist perspective. So it's quite important to keep this into consideration, particularly because when you have to apply for funding, you need to apply under a certain sort of like category or like field, and you need to know where your research kind of falls. So working with a sort of like interdisciplinary perspective, I would say is strategically quite useful. And then intersectionality is also key. Intersectionality, for those of you that may not be familiar with the term, sort of considers other identity vectors in order to determine how oppressed or what position we can occupy in a given society. So yeah, I'm a woman, but I'm white and I'm queer, and this is different from being a woman who is Black and straight. Like this, all of these sort of like identity vectors intersect in different ways, and they sort of like allow me to be in a more privileged position or not, depending as well on my context. Everything is highly contextual. So I was mentioning before, the emotional impact of doing gender studies is huge. I had an experience when I started doing my PhD. I went to a conference that was called Doing Women's Film and Television History. And it was all women, there were no men, which we can discuss this later because I think it's a problem, but whatever. And at the end of the conference, because it had been such a sort of like cathartic experience for all of us, the organizers who were talking about the importance of fighting for like fair representation and gender equality in the media and so on, so like actually broke down crying in the sort of like closing act of this was an international conference with lots of funding, and I've never seen that before in any other field. So this is something that touches us. We're talking about issues that are highly important to us from an emotional perspective, and this will also affect the methodologies that we can or may want to implement, but we will talk about that a bit later on. And we already mentioned the varying degrees of development of gender studies in their fields. Just to give you an example, a couple of years ago, we conducted a study to see how many courses had the word gender in their name in media degrees or communication degrees or journalism degrees in Spain, and like maybe 2 or 3. It was very heartbreaking to see that. Whereas if you go to the US or the UK, as little as I want to be like Anglophilic, the situation changes. So we may be more or less privileged as gender scholars, depending on where we're based. Why does this matter? Well, to sort of like reasons. First of all, the amount of institutional support that we can access, but secondarily, why does doing research on gender studies matter? I think it's quite clear. As researchers on gender studies, the papers or reports that we publish actually inform policy and having an influence on policy making, particularly at the European level, but also at the national level. Right now, in a time where extreme right parties are winning more and more elections and anti-gender movements are sort of like gaining strength, I think it's more important than ever. We need to have the facts and the information to back up the idea that gender equality hasn't been achieved yet, and that we still need to keep on fighting. So I think this, well, I'm not going to say that not all fields have the same impact on society, because that would be untrue, but gender studies has to do with social justice, perhaps to a larger degree than other fields. I also wanted to talk a little bit about how gender studies, being a field that touches us emotionally more than others, and particularly if you're a woman, if you're young, influences the way we present ourselves as scholars. When I started, I felt the need to be more serious. And serious in a patriarchal, white, middle class, cis, LGBT phobic society means assimilating yourself to the way of communicating, presenting yourselves that male professors may have. So you sort of like wear costumes, dress up as a man, like pretend to be more aloof, more distant. And you know what, like I make it right now my political position, my political standing to not do that. If you're not going to take me seriously because I might get emotional talking about things that matter to me, or because I'm wearing something pink, or because I'm being more approachable and kinder in the way I communicate my research, well, you can go to hell. And this is just the way I see it. Sorry for my French. There is also another issue, which is we are at higher risk than other scholars of causing controversy within our departments and institutions, because what we do is often perceived as too political. So it is quite difficult to navigate that. My personal advice would be to not care, because all of us are positioned politically in the minds of others, no matter what we do. So we might as well be unapologetic in this way, no? So some key ideas that I think are important: the question of the study of gender studies as the study of women as a study for women. Are we studying women and girls as the subject matters, or are we studying other things to sort of like fight for women, for women's rights, for gender equality, and so on? So, well, it's personal. You can have your own opinion on this. The gender bias, I think, really matters, because gender, in spite of what I've been sort of like implying throughout this presentation, is not just a women's issue. Like there is also an undue pressure on boys, on men, on masculinity to live up to established norms. And this has also dire consequences in the life of men. Like an example that we can always allude to is the amount of like suicides and that men commit in comparison to women, because of like masculinity being perceived as more strong, etc., etc. And by this, I also mean that gender studies is not only a field for women. Like men are also interested in gender studies and should be, because masculinity, toxic masculinity, also have consequences on them. And that said, me myself have been subject to gender bias when dealing with men that do gender studies. Like I always tend to assume their gender identity or sexual orientation to be non-normative, and that's not necessarily the case. So we, I guess, even if we're doing all this work and even if we're activists, might be prey to microforms of internalized sexism as well. So constantly sort of like deconstructing your own ideas is quite useful, I would say. We already talked about how gender studies intersects with other fields. I also think it's very interesting how naming our field has political connotations. Gender studies used to be called women's studies before, and depending on your position, you might consider this a positive change or a negative change. For some feminists, for women that are part of the feminist movement and kind of ally themselves with a more essentialist, even trans-exclusionary view, calling gender studies rather than women's studies erases the protagonism of women in this field. But we have already talked about how gender roles and gender assumptions are harmful for men as well as for women or for non-binary people. So I guess this is up to you how you want to introduce yourself and the connotations that it may or may not have. I also find it really interesting, the concept of feminist methodologies, because of the assumption that women are more personal, emotional, subjective, less scientific than men. Qualitative methods have been more associated with the field versus quantitative methods, like being considered like more masculinistic, like empirical, rational, and so on. But I mean, it's kind of stupid. We can implement whatever methodology we want, and that doesn't invalidate our results. So there is a feminist criticism to be made of the masculine knowledge production sort of model. And like I said, we will sort of like expand on these concepts later on. Then I have a little summary of the different waves of feminism out there for anyone who's not familiar with it. At the moment, what interests me personally the most is the sort of like, not gap, but transitioning between what some people call the fourth wave and post-feminist values. So yeah, post-feminist values kind of assume that feminism and the fight for gender equality is no longer needed because we have already achieved gender equality in most contexts, whereas the fourth wave kind of focuses more on issues that have to do with prevailing problems like sexual harassment, then intersectionality, queer theory, etc., etc. Anyway, the idea of the waves of feminism itself may be questioned because it sort of implies that only one type of feminism exists at a time, and it's always like an overlapping kind of situation. So this is a study that Margaret Eichler did in 1988 on how gender, or the study of gender, like is prey to 5 specific types of danger. And even though she wrote this paper in the 80s, a lot of her ideas are still like quite contemporary, right? So she talks about androcentricity, which is approaching an issue from a male perspective. For example, the field of work studies didn't used to consider domestic labor as work under the category of work. Overgeneralizing is research that focuses on men, generally speaking, leading to conclusions about both sexes. An example of this would be the fact that well, probably one of the most underfunded and under-researched areas of medicine is gynecology. Gender insensitivity is a failure of a researcher to consider gender as any variable, like that doesn't even feature in our surveys, in our interviews, etc., etc. This is quite uncommon today, but it still happens in some contexts. Then yeah, we have the double standards. So we evaluate men and women with different standards. It would be like sort of like the opposite of overgeneralizing, but both extremes aren't great. And then interference, which is when we're particularly working with subjects, with humans, that they may react to our gender, like for women and particularly for young and looking a certain way, more than to the research itself. This happens quite often, unfortunately, and we may have to be ready to deal with it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about methods here. We may divide, is is somehow reductionist, but we may divide methodologies for research between the traditional methodologies, which are usually quite sexist, quite elitist, and sort of like exploit the researched rather than considering them as fully functional subjects. So a lot of the research, for example, that was done on reproduction in the 1920s, 30s, 40s in the US was conducted in like Caribbean islands with Black women, and kind of like treated them as animals and exploited them. And well, it is, like I said, sexist, elitist, racist, etc., etc. Now we have more critical approaches that, among other things, one of the things that these critical approaches do is the questioning of a priori categories that we may establish for the research. So for example, if usually a lot of surveys consider men and women as the only two possible gender identities, a critical approach to any field would even sort of like question the fact that these are completely exclusionary categories or include others, etc., etc. And as we mentioned before, the focus on all academic endeavor has been the male experience, which was always understood as universal. It is what it is. I also kind of wanted to question the idea of the scientific method as an objective collection of data by a value-neutral researcher. This does not make any sense whatsoever. I don't think, well, this is not just my personal positioning, it's sort of like a feminist approach to research. There is no such thing as collecting data with no sort of interaction with your personal values, your own emotions, etc., etc. So feminist methodologies are trying to kind of rescue other forms of accessing scientific knowledge that sort of like forgo the idea of objectivity, such as autoethnography, the issue of self-identity, working with affects. In fact, it's basically the idea that emotions, affects, and situated knowledge can inform our research in ways that do not invalidate the scientific quality of our results. So yeah, feminist methods in some acknowledge that the results of our research cannot be separated from the conditions of its production. Always consider this. So I like this quote very much. It kind of like takes on the quote by Carol Hanisch, the second wave famous feminist that had this slogan that the personal is political, and takes it one step further. The personal is not just political, but it's also worthy of study. And that's the way we should see it as feminist scholars. We don't have to excuse me because I need more water. I'll be back in a second. So, as I was saying, in spite of all these constraints and gender bias and unfairness and inequality when it comes to research on gender studies, there are some positive news, which is the fact that right now feminism and gender equality are, at least on paper, very, very high on the agenda of international bodies such as the UN, UNESCO, the European Union. So that's pretty great. In terms of the UN, probably what was like a landmark, like a hit for women and gender equality, and this also has consequences on the funding that we have access to, was the 1995 Fourth World Conference on Women, which took place in Beijing. And it resulted in a declaration and platform for action, which was adopted by many countries, and it had different areas of concern. Well, it's been pretty great, pretty important. Now going down to business and to sort of like more pragmatic and practical resources. I have collected some of the institutional databases and resources that might be useful to collect data, particularly when we want to back up your research with numbers, which, like I said before, quantitative doesn't necessarily mean better. That's a very masculinist way of thinking. Probably the most useful of these ones, particularly for those of you who are working from a European country, would be EIGE. EIGE collects, analyzes, and disseminates data and information on gender equality issues within the EU. And what they do is really important because governments from across the EU take these reports in order to make their policies and laws and such, and consider gender equality in their policy making. The links to all of these resources are available in the presentation, which, like I said, I'm very happy to share. Then we have Gender Watch, which is a database. This one's like, it belongs to ProQuest, so that means it's not that easily accessible. But it includes text articles and book chapters and reports and even dissertations on how gender impacts various subject areas. It's quite useful, but it's probably not going to provide you with anything that you wouldn't be able to access through Google Scholar, but it's more specific. So if you wanted to do something on like what's the number of papers that deal with gender in a specific sort of like discipline, you could use Gender Watch. And then we have resources that have been created, are compiled by the UN, many statistics and indicators in women and men. We have the World Women's Report, we have the UNDP Gender Equality Index. It's all of this is public, it's easily accessible. And it sort of like supports the cases that we might want to make as the scholars when we're like underlining the importance of doing research that has to do with gender. No, if the numbers back up the idea that gender equality hasn't been achieved in a certain context, in a certain industry, in a certain area, well, that kind of like validates our qualms. And I put there an example of the Gender Equality Index of EIGE in Bulgaria. Then I also wanted to give you an example of teaching resources in the field of gender studies and again, situated knowledge. This is an example that I was involved in. I am a member of a UNESCO monitoring network on gender, media, and ICTs. Like I said, media studies is my field. So I believe it was 2019, we set up to design a model course to train gender sensitive media and journalist students with several different units that you have there on the right. Because we realized that from various contexts, like we're all kind of like designing these types of courses, but why not sort of like you make it uniform and have like these available for everyone that might want to design a course. It can be for a university degree, but it can also be an informal training for real journalists. So it was kind of like a community endeavor. It looks like this. Talks about the goal of the different units, introduces the topic, divides it in sub-themes, and then you can kind of like mix and match. So you look at it, you look at the syllabus, and you're like, oh, I'm specifically interested in the expertise of women in the media, and you go there and you grab the references because it has references, activities that you can do, etc., etc. So it's there. Positive aspects of this model course are the transversal approach, because, well, this doesn't happen only in media studies. I think it happens in all disciplines, that we tend to relegate gender as a sort of like specialization, like as an elective course, rather than considering gender something that traverses the content of everything that we need to study and research. So it's quite transversal, it's highly adaptable to different contexts, because of course feminist thought hasn't been further to the same extent, the same degree in Spain as it might have in Mali, for example. And excuse me for being so sort of like ethnocentric here. It's intersectional. All of the units talk about race, talk about class, talk about sexual orientation, and it seeks to link theory with practice. So like I said before, quite useful if you want to design any kind of course that has to do with gender. Then I have another resource there that might be useful for any of you. And I think it's not only useful if you're working in media, it's also useful as a sort of like a study case of successful European Union project, because this was created with European funding, and it's a web platform that is considered, well, is designed to be like a sort of like shopping mall for everyone that's interested in gender equality in media industries. So you have lots of different resources that you can click on and access. We collect good practices. We collect organizations that are promoting gender equality in the media. We have learning units as well for anyone that's teaching a course in gender equality in the media. We collaborate with other initiatives, and we do interviews with media professional activists, policymakers, and experts. I will talk about this later on more, because I think that the alliances that gender scholars can establish outside academia are very important, fruitful, and particularly useful when we're trying to access European funding, because they do care about transference, but this is another topic. And I think the most interesting feature is probably the app, because this translates all of our research and ideas to some like real action that the users of the website can implement. So like it's an app, if you see like a news item that has something very sexist, the app sort of like makes it easy for you to denounce it, so it can lead to actual change. This is probably the most useful thing that I can tell you as an early, sorry, my voice is running out already. As an early career scholar, there are many things happening in the field of gender studies, and it's almost impossible to be up to date on all the conferences, the call for papers, the associations, the books, everything that's being published. So newsletters are very helpful in this regard. My favorite when it comes to gender issues is Agender. You may be familiar with it. Here's a link to the mailing list. They send a weekly or daily updates on interesting call for papers and international conferences about gender. I use it all the time because as a publishing strategy, I would say that call for papers that deal with special issues of indexed journals are much more efficient or practical way of getting your research published, because they take less time to get published. If you apply to the sort of like general section of a journal, it might take up to 2 years, whereas special issues take like a couple of months, maybe 6. And the agenda mailing lists provides you like a comprehensive list of all the call for papers and special issues that have to do with gender in different disciplines, and then international conferences. And then we have like repositories of job offers. This one is specific for northern countries, but probably we have something similar in the south. I haven't come across it, but if you do, please let me know. This offers information on gender profile vacancies, internship positions in the Nordic region in academia, so it's quite useful if you're looking for a job. And then there are different UNESCO networks on gender. Mine is the one that deals with media, but there are others, and I think they provide really good opportunities for networking and coming up with international with collaborations amongst several universities, which is always very useful for Horizon Europe projects and so on. So then I wanted to talk about journals in the field of gender studies. I thought it was very interesting because, well, the way I approach looking for journals, I only go for index journals. I don't know how much importance indexation has in your countries, but in Spain is key. So I no longer publish my research in journals that aren't indexed unless it's a friend's journal or it's like something that might be emerging, very new to the field, because it's a bit of a waste of time if you ask me. So when I was looking for journals in Simago or in Web of Science, which are the two main databases, Simago is Scopus, Web of Science is more like JCR, I found none in Bulgaria. So that already kind of gives you a clue of how developed or underdeveloped the field might be. I give you here only 4 examples of journals that have gender studies as a category. As you can see, they belong to very, very different disciplines, like here's Gender and Society. And I gave you also like titles of the types of articles that they publish. But yeah, you can actually explore that within your fields like very easily by accessing these databases. Then book collections are also quite important. Again, here it might be because this matters in my context very much, but I think it's useful to check out the indexation of the publishing house in SPI, Scholarly Publishers Indicators. I'll put a link there, although it's in Spanish, and these are 3 collections that are quite useful. Well, the Rooted's research is a collection, and the Cambridge Studies in Gender and Politics is a collection, but the Peter Lang Emerging Scholars Competition is actually a competition for scholars to get their work published in Peter Lang, which is it's very high in the ranking of academic publicators. So yeah, these are some options that you might want to consider. Like I say, all of this is indexable hyperlinks in the presentation. Then grants. This is probably the most useful part of it. So I would say the most interesting one, if you have recently completed your PhD, which is my case, is the ERC starting grant. You can apply for this grant between 2 and 7 years after you completed your PhD. This is the date that you defended your thesis, that you were awarded the degree of doctor. And you need to have an excellent track record as a research. Excellent track record doesn't necessarily mean publish a shitload of papers and so on. So they actually ask you only to mention up to 5 publications but they have to be major international peer-reviewed scientific journals, or the leading national scientific journals, etc., etc. They also consider conference papers, but I wouldn't apply to an ERC with conference papers, in all fairness. Yeah, and you need to put the DOIs of all the documents. They also consider monographs, patents, although I don't know to which extent this is relevant in the field of gender studies. Well, I guess if you're working in pure sciences, maybe. Invited presentations to international studies conferences or prizes, awards, and memberships. I would go with publications. It's just safer, generally speaking. And they give you 1.5 million over 5 years. There are different panels that you submit your proposal to. Probably the most useful would be what's called the panel SH8, that deals with issues with kinship, diversity, and gender. I know it seems daunting to apply for European funding, but it really isn't that difficult to get. The success rate is 15%. That's not so tiny, and it's highly prestigious. It's a lot of money. You can have an incredible impact with an ERC starting grant, and it's very high in the European Union's priorities right now to fund projects that deal with gender equality, particularly in contexts where gender equality perhaps is not very established within academia. So I definitely encourage anyone who sort of has all the prerequisites to apply for this. I will myself soon. Then we also have the CERF program. This is the Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values program of the European Union, which aims to protect and promote union rights and values as they are enshrined in the EU Treaty's Charter of Fundamental Rights. well, promoting European values can mean anything, but the thing is, as we will see in a second, again, gender equality is high. It's considered to be a European value for some reason. Unbeknownst to me, I would say it's a human value, but whatever. Then we have various national research councils, depending on your country. In the UK, the most typical are the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Economy and Social Sciences Research Council. You can click there, I put an example of the grants that you can achieve. So I'm sorry, I couldn't provide like a country-to-country case sort of study of the national research councils that you have, but they're out there. And then we have institutional grants. Institutional grants are possibly the most easily accessible. A lot of universities or even government bodies have centers or institutes for gender studies that offer a variety of PhD and postdoc funding opportunities. The money that you will get is never going to be as big as the money you would get for ERC or a SERF, but it's very, very feasible. So to give you an example, the year before I completed my PhD in Spain, as part of the Ministry for Equality, we have something called the Institute of Women, and they provide funding for research projects that have impact on society. It's not a lot of money, but it's up to 20,000 if I remember correctly. I think it's important here to note that purely research projects like the ERC starting grant and institutional sort of like grants that are given by the bodies of government are a bit different in what they prioritize. So bodies of government will prioritize transference activities that have an actual impact on society and that are not purely research based. So as I was saying, before I even completed my PhD, I applied for one grant by the Instituto de las Mujeres with a project that dealt with the representation of girl teenagers in Netflix and HBO TV shows, and proposed a training program, like a training course with high school students to reflect on issues such as sexual harassment, reproductive rights, consent, etc. And like I came second, it was quite feasible. So that's probably a chance over there. And then, like I said, the equality rights and gender equality is one of the 4 or 3 categories of the SERV. Here are on the left are the different lines of research that you may pursue. And they also have like a database with open calls, which is easily accessible there. I left it there in case you might use it. And then another example of a positive experience. This is a SERF project, EU SERF, Citizens, Equality, Rights and Values. The project is called Rewriting the Story in Gender, Media and Politics. And I'm a part of this project, of course. It comprises 3 partners: the International Federation of Journalists, COPEAN, which is a non-profit that works with broadcasters in the Euro-Mediterranean region, and the University of Padua. I work with the University of Padua, Center for Gender Studies. And this is an example of how alliances between academia and associations and non-profits can be highly productive in the context of European projects. So we conducted, we had 4 different phases for this: research and data collection on the representation of women politics, activities with the students. I'll show you some examples in a second. Module design and implementation. So the goal of this project was to design a training module for journalists to cover the upcoming European election with a gender lens. I'm sorry about that. I'm at home, someone's ringing. See, situated knowledge. So this module has been designed. Now in June, we will have the first training with representatives of union of journalists of 12 different countries. And then the people that attend this first training module will train the journalists in their own context. So it's kind of like a multiplicatory effect. And then some peer-to-peer training will be conducted with broadcasters. So to give you an example of what we're doing with the students, I think it's quite fun. So we work with the students from various universities. At the moment, the University of Padova, the Complutense, the University of Newcastle, and the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And we asked them to create like creative projects that deal with the representation of women in politics. And this was one of the projects, one of my favorites. They sort of like looked for sentences, like quotes that a journalist had written about politicians in sort of like comparable positions and put the picture. And then, well, as you can see here, they call her menopause Greta Thunberg, which is seminary sexist, and then the Association of Men with Reason here for another male politician. And then they explain the context and give you like activities, ideas for analysis, etc., etc. So yeah, this is what we do in the context of this project. As you can see, we're working with many different actors, and like again, I cannot stress enough how much the importance of working with different actors increases your likelihood of getting European funding, because that's kind of like how it works. Okay, I'm here. I'm almost done, thank God, because my voice is about to disappear. I also left you there examples for international conferences. International conferences are great opportunities to network and to work with people. So to give you an example, many years ago in the International Association of Media and Communication Research, we had like a section on gender, and this is where I got in touch with the UNESCO network on gender and media. I started working with an Italian professor named Claudia Padovani. She's amazing. And she's the reason I then did a research stay at Padova University. And then now I participate in this lovely project that deals with the representation of women politicians. So never underestimate the kind of contacts that you can make in these international conferences, not also because they can lead to great projects and networking opportunities, but also because they remind you that you're part of a community fighting for the same things. And this is really important as gender scholars. Then I think I'm going to skip this because this is just a learning experience that we had. We did like workshops on gender and media with PhD students. But this is just to stress how important it is to be aware of the pre-existing resources. Because for this workshop, we've worked with the new syllabi that I showed you before, with the UNESCO's gender-sensitive indicators for the media and with online platforms. So we don't have to start from zero whenever we're doing a research project or we're teaching or we're designing a course. I cannot stress that enough, because working in academia is precarious enough. If we are wasting our time by not being aware of the resources that are already out there, it's just very tiring. Yeah, so these are some examples of the results of this workshop. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and jump to the conclusions, because I think I've already talked enough for today, tomorrow, and possibly the entire week. This is a bit of a repetition of what I've already been mentioning. Researchers and professors in our field, in our area, we face a specific contextual and personal challenges. Like I said before, the lack of seriousness that our field is supposed to have, the accusations of being too emotional, too political, the fact that what we do is directly linked to our identity and our emotions. But the positive side, and I cannot stress this enough, is that now we have more opportunities than ever to access really good funding projects and to come up with innovative ideas and to have a real impact on society. Like what we're doing changes people's lives, and this is just a fact. And like maybe it sounds too naive, but I don't care. I think we need to be a bit naive. Then the value of making use of the available resources that we have, and the value of creating transnational worker networks and alliances with actors outside academia. This is not useful only for European funded projects, it's also useful for your personal careers. Like sometimes for example, I give workshops with real journalists outside European projects, or workshops in the context of international film festivals. And not only you can disseminate your work outside formal academic context, which is something that other scholars from other fields may not be able to do, because who is interested in the development of a molecule that may cure cancer? Well, probably people that understand that language, but most of us will only see it in the media and not like maybe go to the talk. But however, if we're talking about the representation of lesbian teenagers in film, well, you have non-profit associations and music and film festivals and other people that are interested in this. So that is great. Being able to talk with people that are outside academia is amazing, because it keeps us in touch with reality, and because the language that we have to utilize is different. So I think it's really cool. And then again, emphasizing the idea that the personal is not just political, but it's also worthy of being the object of a study of our researchers. So never underestimate the value of emotions, of situated knowledge, of personal experience, because this is also a way of doing science. And with this, I will conclude now and just breathe and stop speaking. Thank you very much for your attention. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much for that. It was very interesting, even for me. I can see that we already have raised hands. And yeah, actually, most of the networks you mentioned, I knew them, but you mentioned some more, some resources. And, you know, I've been dealing with this subject for a long time, and I learned a lot. So that was very, I really appreciate that. And now I think we can, so are there raised hands? I saw one raised hand and then it disappeared, but you're all most welcome to join us and to discuss. We have one thank you for the presentation, and we have someone had to leave. Yeah, that happens. If they don't have questions for now, because, you know, in many cases people are shy in the beginning, I can ask you something.
Of course.
So my first thought is when it comes to journals, what I've noticed, and I think it should be discussed within gender studies environments, journals such as Journal of Sex Research, and most of the journals who stay, let's say, on the top of the ranking, they are, except probably Gender in Society, most of the Journal of Sex Research, Sex Roles, Journal of Sexual Behavior, I think Archives of Sexual Behavior, they are tend to tolerate mostly quantitative research.
I know, it's horrible.
I've tried most of them. I've tried, and you receive sometimes. I recently had an experience with Journal of Sex Research this year, actually, a month ago, and I submitted a project which was developed under my Marie Curie postdoc fellowship in Belgium.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you. And I would say, you know, it's not something that hasn't been seen by many people so far. And that was a paper reconsidering, based on interviews, how people come out in different environments, let's say in non-Western context. And what I received from one of the managing editors was, so you have a paper which states that it's on coming out and it's in Bulgaria. And the editor, one of the editors sent me a short note that they will reject it because it doesn't say, I'm quoting, what exactly coming out is, and it doesn't include any cultural aspects. So I believe, so that was the first time in my life when I dared to write the editor back. I've never done it before. And then I said, I'm very sorry, but that's exactly what the paper is on, the thing you're saying that it is not. And she said, that's a very knowledgeable editor. I trust them. So, there was no point to argue anymore. But so they are, there is certain, how to say, that's someone from Bulgaria somewhere. Probably it's not good. I'm not going to even read that, And so I'm very skeptical when it comes to, I would suggest Sexualities Journal. It's one of how to say, that's a very inclusive environment. It's based in Essex, probably, University of Essex. And because it's founded by Kenneth Plummer, who is one of the, the figures in LGBT sociology and sexuality in general. So it's quite open to qualitative research as well. I have very good experience with the journal, International Women's Studies. How's that called? Journal? I have a publication there. Sexuality and Culture is also a journal which is, how to say, open to different regions. But there are many journals who stay within, a closed circle of friends. They don't let people in, no matter what you do.
I think you have it worse in the social sciences because so I'm a film scholar, and it's kind of weird. Film studies sometimes is considered as part of the arts and humanities, sometimes it's considered social sciences, but generally speaking, I have access to journals in arts and humanities, and these journals are more open to non-quanti methodologies and to like more interpretative, sort of like hermeneutical approaches. So thankfully, I haven't had to suffer what you're telling me so much. However, in Spain, no. In Spain, no matter if you're doing film analysis, you still need to be quanti, and that's completely stupid. And I would say, to a certain extent, it perpetuates the idea of science as something that has to be very objective and empirical and all that. And this only makes sense if you're doing biology, not if you're doing sociology or like film studies. It's completely nonsensical.
I have another very interesting one, which I also want to mention, because the title of one of my papers that was rejected a few months ago, now it's accepted, but in another journal. So one of the reviewers said, it's, I believe, an American professor, because judging by the things he suggested. So he said, you don't mention what non-heterosexual people means. If you want to coin this term, pay attention. If you want to coin this term, it's like, and I wanted to say them, listen, there are almost 9,000 results on Google Scholar when you type non-heterosexual. How you can evaluate something in gender, sexuality, and you claim that you still don't know what non-heterosexual means. It's situated knowledge within that framework, because non-heterosexual, that's a very critical point of view why we use this. So you can see all this craziness in many journals.
It is absurd. I had once, and this was mind-blowing to me. This was a Q1 journal, and we submitted a paper, and they asked us to provide them with the name of like 10 possible reviewers.
Mm-hmm.
So we had friends of ours reviewing our own paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of the journals have this. They have it. And, we probably have to talk here. And if you're still invited to join us, all of you, I can see some familiar names here. They have a huge problem nowadays finding reviewers.
Yeah.
it's extremely difficult. You can see people complaining. 30 people rejected the paper recently. They don't have time. You know, teachers don't have time because it's not paid. You just,
Yeah, some journals are starting now to pay reviewers, but
what do they?
yeah, we have one, Complutense, but these are the journals that generally speaking also charge for publication, which is something that I consider slightly unethical. So that conversation, oh my God, we could spend so many hours discussing the publishing, sort of like the politics of publishing.
Yeah, I can give you all an example. Some colleagues of mine, I know most of them during the anti-gender studies in the recent years, they founded a journal which it's going to be hard now to find, but it's called Politics in Gender, European Journal of Politics in Gender, something between the lines. And it's an open access one. So the idea there is it's people who will submit and they will, you know, it's kind of like it's the real purpose of peer reviewing. We help each other. And then at the end, it's an open access journal. Of course, it still doesn't have any rank on scope.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned that in many environments, it's a value. I mean, in Bulgaria, it gives you a lot of credits if you publish in a Scottish.
Yeah. In Spain, it's even tied to salary, sort of like complements.
I
So
know.
I hate perpetuating this hierarchy within the scientific community, but you kind of have to be strategic because otherwise you'll never get a job that allows you to be a human being existing in a capitalist society. Like, as much as an activist and a critical thinker that we want to be, in reality, we deal with the material conditions of our own existence. So
when we do, you know, because Bulgaria is lagging behind a lot of in terms of scientific, you know, metrics, and especially in social sciences. So they want to catch up. And now when we do evaluations, you get, if you have something in Scopus, you will get for evaluation from 6 to 14 points for a paper, depending on the group. And then if you publish something in Bulgarian outlet, you get 0.2 points.
oh,
I know.
well, it also leads to very interesting and stupid situations in Spain. We have like 4 levels of certification for professors, and they give you points for publications. You
Yeah.
get more points for an article in an index journal than for publishing your own book, even if it's in a really good publishing house.
You cannot. That's
Ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous. But yeah, like it's all very perverted. And I don't mean perverted in the good way that I do when I'm talking about queer theory. I mean perverted in the worst sense of the word.
Well, you know, unfortunately, it's all about, it's a neoliberal academia. That's one of the biggest problems there. And that's a huge discussion. Probably, did you mentioned add gender, but I think you probably I didn't pay attention at that time when you were speaking about the conferences. Did you mention the upcoming conference in Istanbul this year?
I think I did.
At gender, they have almost every year conferences. So there will be a very nice conference in Istanbul for those of you who might not know. It's the spring conference, but it's going to be in September. So the call for proposal is open now, and they have a section on strength on anti-gender as well. So that's a nice event because at gender events, they don't usually charge a lot when it comes to fees, participant fees. I attended, it was with sponsorship, of course. I attended the British Association for Eastern European Studies this March, and they had no discounted fees for Eastern European countries.
That's absurd.
So we all had to pay £250, which is very expensive for us. It's almost half your salary.
Who has that kind of money?
That's why I like events which are considerate of those inequalities, and they don't usually charge a lot in general. There is another conference I want to mention. It's a network, so it has more geographical perspective, and it's called Geographies of Sexualities. It takes place every 2 years, and actually last September it was in Cadiz, and we had wonderful time in Cadiz. So
That is incredible. Yeah.
that's another event which is probably, I should put some links here. Wait.
I'm giving you the name that I type over there is of a colleague of mine. He's amazing, and he does research on anti-gender movements and its alliances with fascist parties. And he's attending the Istanbul conference.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I know that you're doing this. So like, here's this guy's name. He's awesome.
We also plan to go to that conference. So I can give you the Geography of Sexuality network. Even though it's supposed to be mostly on geography, it gets people from every branch of science, philosophers, sociologists. So you don't have these limits. We are geographers and we don't accept anyone. Just the opposite. They try to be very
Yeah, makes sense.
and you pay some, let's say 60 or 80 euro participation fee, which is quite fair. It's fair. And I like this because I'm often discussing the European Sociological Association. They have some 3,000 or 4,000 people, and they charge every 2 years 400 euros. And it becomes a lot of money, So I don't really like this neoliberal type of activities within the conferences inside. So yeah, and do we have some thank you? So you have one more thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, and do you want to add something, Lucia? Apparently we're not gonna have questions.
Well,
But it's an info session, I understand, and you explained all very well. So
I mean, I think the only thing, in case someone is starting their career now, is that there's a lot of opportunities and there's hope.
there, I believe that, and I've done things on my experience with scholarships, but the only thing is that you have to be very persistent. You have to apply all the time. You have to improve your applications. So you have to fight. If you wait that someone will come and offer something, it's not.
Yeah, and that's why we need networks of support, because honestly, it is very heartbreaking when you submit a proposal that like really touches you emotionally because you're talking about stuff that intersects with your own identity, and you get rejected over and over again. So have a network of support of other scholars that are interested in the same things. Cry with them, work with them, get drunk with them, like whatever, but that's key.
Okay, and I understand how exhausting it can be, and you spoke a lot. So I would suggest that we leave you in peace now.
That sounds like I'm dying.
You can relax. And really, really, thank you so much for this one. That was wonderful. I needed that. And I have some ideas, but I'm going to discuss that in an email.
Oh yeah, that would be great. Please get in touch. And thank you.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Lucia. And see you soon somewhere, I hope.
I see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.